With the start of my first word, my time will begin. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining the first Constructive Speech and Debate podcast. This is a podcast for everything speech and debate in Texas. Our names are Ryan Stokes and Kenny Adcock, and we are excited to continue this journey with you. As we begin to work through the upcoming season, it is our goal to share some stories, introduce you to experts, and facilitate conversations that we hope will help you throughout your season as well. So, whether you are a coach, student, competitor, or parent trying to figure out what crazy event your student participates in, welcome to the show. Today we are joined by Daniel Gambill. Daniel's the theater director, UIL coordinator, and Prose and Poetry Coach with me at Sunnyvale High School. He has had great success across all three of his responsibilities for the school, with the most recent one being coaching a student back-to-back state appearances and a second-place finish last year. So we are super excited to have him on tonight as we cover the topic of prose and poetry, which, if I had to rank as a coach myself, is my worst category, and why I'm so excited that Daniel does that at Sunnyvale and I don't have to. But Kenny, being at the small school that you're at, congratulations to all the hats you have to wear. So, with that being said, let's hop into it. So, area one that we want to cover tonight is the categories this year are Category A, recognizing joy, focusing on the little things, and Category B, inspiring change and striving for a better tomorrow. And these are strikingly different than the ones that we've had for the last few years, which Daniel, I think you actually had a little hand in with those, and I enjoyed the topics, but that we've had over the last 3 years. But these are like a big contrast. So I was going to get y'all's thoughts on like how are you looking at the categories and how can we help students to approach them? So either one of you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I will start by saying I think that I like that the categories are chosen so that we have a drastic change from the topics that we've had in the past, where we've had to look at things that were very serious, very personal, and this is allowing us to really find a place for students who are more comedic in their performance style. So I think that this does lend itself to having students who are both comedic and dramatic, more than the topics that we've had, the categories in the past couple of years. I personally think that the finding joy in the little things is the exciting bit here. It's the kind of the part of this that is going to make this category truly interesting.
Yeah. What about you, Kenny? You got any thoughts on the new topics?
I'm actually really excited. I don't get me wrong, the doom and gloom pieces that we saw out of the last couple of categories, I thought the advocacy and the stories that were told out of those were incredibly powerful, therapeutic at times for even my program and my kids and how we kind of utilize those. But I'm excited to be in an interp round judging and be okay smiling. Right, like I don't have to feel weird smiling at the kid who's reading, the OCD piece from Neil Hilborn, because it kind of like some of those ticks I relate to a little more. I'm excited about that possibility. But I'm also excited that our kids still have the ability to advocate and be a little bit more debatey, and we kind of get to like bridge the speech and debate side of what we do. It's not just I have this really competitive debate program and we're second, or we're not the primary fiddle that our coaches are playing to. I'm really excited because some of my debate kids have crossed over into interp this year, and they're taking that voice and that advocacy and they're putting pieces together and being that advocate or that debater that they get to be. Personally, the documentation requirements, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute, are a little conflicting for me. My personal opinion is I think they should be flipped. I think the category A, focusing joy, should be the unpublished, because I think finding published literature specifically in the poetry ranks is a little bit more challenging, in my personal opinion, or what I've kind of struggled through with some of my kids this year. And inspiring change, I think there's a little bit more poetry, specifically where that literature is published, and that being the publication category kind of like makes it a little more difficult. But I've enjoyed the challenge. Right? I've enjoyed the struggle to find poetry that is a little more happy and upbeat and charismatic. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to see what stories and what collections and what pieces come out of this. We've got some really cool things in the works. I'm excited to hear what Daniel and his kids are putting together for this season.
Yeah. So what I really enjoy about it is that category A is so different than category B if you want it to be, right? Because recognizing joy can be very different than inspiring change. Inspiring change still gives that serious outlet for our very serious students who have things that they want to see done or brought awareness to in the world, right? Where recognizing joy, we can really have that fun comedy piece that I love listening to. Personally, when I get mistakenly put into a Prose and Poetry room. So,
Oh,
yeah. Now, when it comes to piece selection, like, so Daniel, how do you help kids find pieces? Like, do you have like a library of resources that you just have that you've collected over the years, or do you have like a place that you like to recommend or send them? What do you do?
so I will say that I do have so many books just in my classroom, and I have students who are just looking through those kind of for things that do kind of inspire them, that do fit these categories. Um, but one of the things that I think I might be leaning towards this year is looking up pieces through AI. Now I know that that's like hot button, and we're having and there's going to be lots of like people who have feelings about that. But asking an AI bot for examples of poetry that fit my students' specific like joy item, right? So like I have a student who loves astronomy. So and I thought that was so interesting, especially for a prose poetry piece, how we could find something about that translates into a nice selection, nice woven piece. Um, and I think that using an AI is going to be a tool that might help at least to find things that I don't know. Now, if you go into an AI and you ask for poetry, it's going to be like Emily Dickinson is the poet for you, but you have to kind of train it a little bit. But I've kind of found some new things that were interesting and exciting for me. But I do always start with the student and ask them kind of what their interests are, what it is how they connect to the category, what it means to them, and then kind of guide them through finding stuff. I usually ask for several options, and then we kind of find pieces and what I have, and they can look online and try to find books and order them. That's kind of how we get started.
Actually, what about you, Kenny? How do you help kids find pieces?
I use an interview process, right? I sit down and I talk to my kids. Thankfully, like for me, interp is very like therapeutic in nature. And so I want my kids to be an advocate for things that they're personally connected to. I think advocacy is something that's underutilized in the interp space. So right, like my first question that I've always asked them, especially in this category, like right, like for the focusing on change, my first question has always been, so what makes you mad? Right? Like what upsets you the most that you want to be an advocate for it? And then we start kind of like Googling our way through the literature. I'm not gonna lie to you. Your partner here is an AI junkie, so it doesn't shock me that you're on the AI side of things as well. But
It's
I may have
something
to.
brand new to me, but I've tasted the Kool-Aid. So
Yeah. So I may have to borrow that, right? I think it's a great idea to ask, the AI system because they obviously have more resources. And so I think that's a great idea that I might steal from you tonight. But yeah, I sit down and I have an in-depth conversation and we talk about books and we talk about authors and we talk about what story do you want to tell. Like right now, I have a student who's doing a book bans piece for category B because that's the change that they're currently wanting to face. I have a student in poetry who's doing a feminism-esque for category B. And so I have a lot of those like serious issues. I also have a student who for poetry category B is doing a like Hispanic male culture piece and how that change has kind of shifted. And So I have another student who's doing a joy piece on, it's okay to like feel what you feel, right? Like emotions are a good thing and it's okay to have joy in those. And so like just finding literature, and 9 times out of 10, I find myself going to Barnes and Noble and going to, Walmart and just walking through the books section and asking myself, can I piece that? And then I start thinking about the kid that I would want this piece for. And so that's kind of one of my metrics is just, I get lost in bookstores all the time. We have a Books a Million here in Longview that Ryan used to purchase a membership for me. So I'm kind of sad that he left. Now I had to buy my own. And I would just walk through and I'd say, all right, cool. There's, the like Josh Peck right now, a couple of years ago, he wrote a book like Happy People Are Annoying. And I'm really excited to see what story he tells and that like carrying your emotions and that the struggle it is to be a happy person in today's society. Um, a couple of years ago, I had a kid who tried to do a piece over the guy who came up with Enigma for the German code hacking.
Oh yeah.
I think that one I might pull that one out. I bet you would agree. You keep your pieces in a like either electronic or library, correct?
Yes, yeah.
And so I have pieces from years past. Like you've seen the Netflix show Moxie?
I've seen it advertised. It's not something that I've.
So it's also a book that is where they pulled it from. Before Moxie became the movie on Netflix, I had a young lady who was performing Moxie, and it's all about that female empowerment, that school voice empowerment. And so pulling out old pieces is always a staple that I have on my repertoire as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so guys, I'm just gonna let you know if I tried to help a kid cut a piece, I wouldn't know a big moment from a small moment. But we all know that big moments are really what kind of help separate kids in a room, right? Like being able to make the judge feel that big moment. So, like, how would you advise a kid if they're sitting down to cut a piece on like how to build towards that big moment and then have that big moment?
I tend to. So I usually am very close with the student for the cutting process. Once we have found pieces, I tend to get lost in things, and then I will usually present it for them and ask them for the parts that they think that are the big moments for them. And of course, some of that is like, oh no, that's not impactful enough for it to be your like big thing. But I do find a lot of students kind of gravitate toward the same big moment. Those things that you see, those themes that you see over and over and over in prose and poetry rounds, and those big moments that they're no longer big moments because it's something that's tired, it's something that's well used, and they're good still. Like it's not something that was ever good, but that I think that they're some of these bigger moments that kind of have to be navigated through in order to make a piece that truly does stand out and doesn't bore a judge who ideally you have judges who are well versed in prose and poetry and they have seen all of these pieces. But helping them find those big moments for me is truly connecting the kid to the story that's being told. I love this quote from Meryl Streep, the greatest actor of our lifetime. She said, "It's not about what is different between you and the character; it's about what's the same." And so, connecting yourself to the character, and that's what prose poetry is all about. It's just connecting yourself to the character, connecting that piece to the audience, and making them know this character and feel that, have that connection. That's where the all of the spice comes from, anyways. So having that something that you're not having to work against, having that piece that they already naturally are drawn towards, that's really going to help find that big moment on its own, almost.
Okay. What about you, Kenny? How do you help? Do you have anything to add there?
I can't preach loud enough what Daniel just said, right? Like getting a kid connected to a piece is the best thing that I think we can do as intern coaches. But I spend a lot of time with my kids emotionally analyzing the literature. right? Sitting down and I'll have them read it. I'll have another student read it. I'll read it. We'll have multiple people kind of voice the selection or the page by page. And we just kind of roundtable the question, right? Like, okay, so what did you feel when you read this? And one student will say, hey, I felt really happy when I read this. One student will say, I felt really angry when I read this. I felt really, disappointed when I read this. And then trying to walk through those nonverbal, that paralanguage element of the piece of, okay, how do we draw out, because it's your piece ultimately, right? Like it's Daniel's piece at the end of the day. His emotion is what he wants, the audience to feel. And how do we get to that piece? Do we have to talk really loud, or do we have to talk really big, or do we have to bring it down and go really quiet? And so we spend a lot of time talking about paralanguage and what we can do with our voice, because UIL, unlike the NSDA events, doesn't like us to move much. So we have to really empower our student voice and really get into those volumes and do a lot of things here when they don't have, much past the torso movements. So that's one of the big things that I do. And I mean, we're always working. What I've learned is that there's no bad feedback in prose and poetry. There's just feedback that we inherently may disagree with. Like Daniel might hear one of my interpreters perform and they might tell them, hey, I really hate the way you're doing this old person's voice. And then Ryan may hear it and be like, man, that really sounded like my grandpa. And I felt like I was sitting there talking with him. And so there's no bad advice. It's just, now we know that if we get Daniel, we need to overexert the, grandfather voice. And if we have Ryan, we're doing exactly what he wants to hear. And so I kind of take my debate judge adaptation a little bit approach and say, all right, cool. I know that I've got a younger guy who this will be received well, or I have a college kid who maybe we can move a little more, and so those are kind of a couple of the things in those moments that we pull apart is, hey, if I have an older seasoned coach who wants you to just do it with your voice, do it with your book, engage and see it very UIL-esque. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like every judge is different, and it's what makes one of the hardest events to participate in my opinion. Is Daniel could be looking for one thing, I could be looking for another, and Ryan could be looking for something, and we're all on the panel, and you're trying to get our first, second, or third. And so those are kind of some of the things that when I'm sitting down and I'm working interp that I'm really trying to do is, what emotion are you trying to feel? What emotion are you trying to pull? And how can we make sure that's executed well?
I think it's interesting that you bring up how different UIL is from NSDA and other circuits, because that is something that is encountered a lot in Austin at the big dance, is that there are a lot of students who will want to perform for that contest as if they're at NSDA. And that style is amazing, but it is something that you do have to maintain that UIL style in order to be super successful. Ideally, for anyone that is in Austin, you have to kind of pull that back and rein it in so that it does translate for the UIL circuit.
Yeah. I mean, judge adaptation has been the secret to my success. I mean, it's ultimately knowing that I have a Daniel Gambill, and these are the kind of things that he's wanting to see. And Ryan Stokes, if I can make him laugh, I'm going to get his one, right? Like knowing those little things it's been the secret, right? Like at the end of the day, I know that if I have this style of judge, I can do this kind of performance. If I have, a college kid, I can move a little more. And that's the debate brain in me, just being the way that I think, because debate judges, they want to be catered to as well.
Yeah.
So we're going to definitely explore the topic that y'all kind of like bled into there when we get down later in the podcast. But for now, I want to like step away from it for just a second to ask y'all, how do y'all recruit prose and poetry students? Because I'm such a logical person. I have trouble relating to like those kids that are going to be able to give those really good emotional performances. And I'm terrible at talking to them and recruiting them. So like, how do y'all single out like that looks like a prose and poetry kid, and how do you get them involved in your program?
So if you don't mind, Daniel, I'm going to take this one first because I'm not my school district's theater director and I don't have that cheat code in my back pocket.
All right.
Because that theater group is obviously the first breeding ground for interpreters, right? They're your theatrical bunch. They're your dramatized kids. They understand vocal delivery. They understand all of those principles. They understand more of the theatrical rules. They get all of that. So that's obviously like ground number one. But I also think there's, your loud kids on campus, right? Your kids that maybe take a stand on an issue, they have a lane in intern, right? They get to pick their selection, they get to pick their literature, they get to cut their story and tell it how they want to, and nobody can tell them otherwise. Now, that being said, you do have to have the conversation of, would you rather be an advocate or are you chasing ones? Because I think there's a fine line between, I really want to talk about race issues, but I know that it's not going to be received well, and I'm always going to get the 6. And at the end of the day, that's absolutely okay, right? Like, if your point is to be an advocate for your issue and to be loud and proud and tell that story, then those are the kids that I recruit and that I look for, is the ones who are willing to stand up and maybe buck the dress code a little bit, or your rebellious kids who just need an advocate or an outlet for advocacy and just need something a little bit more creative. So I actually like our ISS/troublemaker kids, because I get to give them a lane and I get to give them a venue that creates an entirely different eligibility conversation later on in the third 6 weeks. But those are really kind of some of my big secrets, is I look for my loud kids, I look for my advocates, and I say, all right, cool, I have the thing for you. You get to be as loud and you get to beat the drum and you get to be as proud as you want and tell your story. That's what we get to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that it's finding, I don't know, it's such a difficult question. It's finding the balance of the kid that you were just talking about, Kenny. And I think that it's finding that kid, but then also finding the kid that can take stuff home and will work on it. Because I find that prose and poetry, more so than anything else that I've ever coached, is something that if you don't do any work at home on the inter piece and finding where the cut is strange and is choppy, is hard to work on, that those kids, if they're not going to be able to go home and do it, then those are the kids that are going to be more of a struggle to get to being successful as far as like meddling, right? So I love what you're talking about with kids who this is a platform for them to be advocates, to fully get their voice heard. And I think that this is definitely that place. If those kids are wanting to then translate that into more medals and more into advancing and that kind of stuff, then the conversation is going to have to turn into, you've got to do some of this work at home so that you can bring changes to me, you can bring choices to me that we can then mold, right? Because if you don't ever work on the Play-Doh and it just sits on the table, it's going to dry out and it's just going to be brittle, and nobody's going to vote for a brittle piece of Play-Doh. But I think that I look for students who are definitely the loud students, but the students who know what they feel and what they think. There's a bit of confidence there that just makes me look at a student and say, I think that kid would be good in poetry. And I think that it's difficult that we only have the 6 spots for a whole school as far as UIL is concerned, because there are so many kids sometimes that could work in this, and that's what is great about having the different circuits.
It's actually one of the biggest reasons I do NSDA, because looking at my 9 prose kids and saying I only get to take 3 of you to district is just gut-wrenching. It's just gut-wrenching. But then I can look at that same kid and say, hey, but you've got a really great DI over here that you might get to go to Iowa. Or, hey, you've got a really great HI. We're going to shift our gears. And I'm so thankful for NSDA and TFA, because I can then say, all right, cool, you're not done, but we're going to work on something different.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay. So rules in prose and poetry are very important. When it comes to like doc check, everyone has a doc check nightmare. I had a doc check nightmare because, like, what's doc check? And then I'm sure y'all have had doc check nightmares or seen doc check nightmares. So, like, what are some important rules that students and coaches should know if they're doing this for the first time?
Yeah, I will say doc check nightmares are truly the most uncomfortable place to be, because in so many cases there's nothing that can happen. That's why on our region advisory committee that we have selected the past 2 years to do early doc check, where it can all be submitted beforehand, so that the weeks leading up to region, that okay, this is not like, this doesn't pass documentation check, so I need you to go, and I need you to find this and bring it back to us, right? So we have not had to disqualify anybody for any documentation violations for the past 2 years of region, which I think is probably pretty rare. But the worst thing that can happen is not knowing what documentation check is, right? So you have to prove several different things that are on those documentation forms on the Prose and Poetry website, and they're easy to find for anybody that is maybe listening to this and is like, I don't even know where to start for that. If you will go on there, and if you just will ask Jana Riggins for a coach that's near you that can help you navigate documentation check, it'll be easy and smooth sailing. Like, it's not difficult once you just have it kind of under your feet, right? But that documentation is that's actually why category B for the past several years has been no documentation, basically, so that it makes the contest more accessible. But if yeah.
So I have two stories. I have two stories. The first is in my original my first teaching job. I was the speech and debate coach at Marshall High School, coaching against Ryan. And I had a poetry girl who had been in the top 16 that year at the Longhorn Classic. If that gives you a reference point for how the quality of interpreter she was. And I messed up documentation, and she didn't get to participate in district. And I have never there have been only a couple of handfuls of time that I have felt like the world's worst coach, and that's probably top 3 on my list, just because I messed something up. The other two are being at nationals, ironically still interpolated. I didn't realize Prose and Poetry, as a consolation of it for my coaches out there, is 5 minutes, not 7. So for anybody out there that ends up in the console bracket, Prose and Poetry is only 5 minutes. Cut your selection so you're ready for that, and you don't have to take the phone call from your kids mid-round while you're judging a World Schools round, because they've never been more angry. But the second one was actually this past year. We had managed to make it through doc check at district and region. And I had some hard district. I had a hard district chair, and I had a hard region chair. I mean, they were disqualifying people for getting doc wrong, and they didn't catch my mistake. I had put 2 pieces that I thought were the same name underneath the unpublished category, but they were 2 separate pieces. Until I got to state, did they not catch it. What I'm really thankful for, and this is a kind of one of the things I want to make our coaches aware out there, is the state doc check. I want to shout out the theater director at High School called me and said, hey, this is wrong. I found it. You need to go get it. And here's the publication. Here's where it is. You're going to be fine. You just have to do this work. That's the kind of doc check we have. Like, those are the guys that we have doing it. They don't want to disqualify us.
Right.
They inherently don't want us, like, we got to the top 12 in the state, and they don't want us not being there because we did something. And that's the thing about doc check. It's never, I don't believe it to ever be malicious. There may be 1 in 100, but I've never seen it malicious, right? They've never inherently tried to skirt the rounds of doc check because they were trying to sneak this unpublished piece or whatnot. It's honest mistakes that happen because we're human. One thing I will encourage our coaches out there that are listening, pick up the phone and call Jana. She'll take the phone call. Don't feel like you're bothering her. She wants us to be successful. She wants the best of the best at Austin whenever we get there, right? She wants me rubbing shoulders with Daniel, who's a large and proud, better inter coach than I'll ever be. But I want to be able to say that I'm in those conversations, and they're willing to help you get there. I'll speak up, and I'm sure Daniel would say the same. I'll give you my phone number. I'll give you my email. Send your documentation my way. I'll give you a check. I run districts. I do those kinds of contests. I'll check it to the best of my ability, but I would encourage you to do 1, 2, 3, 4 multiple checks, because I made it through district and region and people didn't catch my error. And so doc check is scary. It's human. It's where we make mistakes. It's where unfortunately kids pay the price, and we've got to be the best coach we can be for kids.
Yeah, that's all good. Okay, last area, and this is where like the bread and butter of what separates, I think, our students at the district level, the regional level, and the state level, and that's kind of what y'all were talking about earlier, which is like, what do judges look for in a prose and poetry round? And so, like, first thing, let's talk technical skills. So, like, bookwork and movement. How would you coach bookwork and movement to a kid who, like, is maybe picking up a prose and poetry book for the first time, or one that's just trying to make it to that next level? They've been like fourth in the room at district and finals, and they really, really just want to go to region. So, like, what are some of the technical things they can work on, and like, how can they do that?
Daniel, before I open can I ask where you order your black books from?
Um, the Black Book Depot.
Okay. I think it's important for our audience to hear that, because there is a difference between a Black Book Depot book and a Black Book 1-inch binder that you ordered off Amazon.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Black Book
Because
Depot is just the place to go. And the real reason is not because, oh, there's some unwritten rule that the inner circle knows, and it's really just that there's a when a student goes up to perform and they have a black book, it's easy to ignore it. It just disappears, and so a judge is able to focus on the performance and the words that the student is using. And so this is a literature reading competition, and a book can get so quickly can get in the way. And but Black Book Depot, like, I'm not endorsed by them. I don't, but I would be glad to be endorsed by them. Just that's the place to go. Yeah.
So I agree with you, right? And this is not a commercial for the Black Book Depot for our listeners, right? But at the end of the day, the informal bookwork and that triangle pose that we informally should train kids to hold books. When you get a 3-inch ring binder from Amazon, Walmart, or any of the stores that sell the black books that look like black books,
Yeah.
they don't fit right in the triangle, and your kids end up holding them weird. And it's a real subtle reason for to be 4-3, right? Like I can't tell you how many ballots I've seen. Like the book just looked uncomfortable. It didn't look like you were holding it in a professional manner. Or I'm sure you've heard this phrase, right? Like we could really see the underwear of the book, and so they end up holding their pages down and they show the pages to the audience, right? Those little tweaks in just ordering a book from a different vendor make an astronomical difference. Again, this isn't a
Right.
commercial for the Black Book Depot. I think they have great prices. I just ordered 6 new books and 100 pages because we need some more. Not that, and if you can get on Amazon and that's what's affordable and that's what your school will approve, get those binders, right? Like get them in your students' hands. Don't not have a binder to perform in. But I definitely think the Black Book Depot is the place to go. I don't know why they construct them differently or what they do that's different than your everyday average binder, but there's something different about them.
Yeah. And I think that, the key difference is that the rings sounds so crazy, but the rings are on the spine as opposed to being at the back of the book. And the difference is just, it's truly remarkable when you see them next to like a student who has that one versus a student who has the rings that are attached to the back of the book. Just that the student is able to seamlessly use that book, but kind of going into the idea of what makes bookwork work is the idea that your binder needs to be invisible unless you want to use it to make a statement. Okay, now it should never in UIL it should never be used as a prop, but to use it to when you turn a page, the page should disappear. You shouldn't see it. unless you're using that to really end a section of the story. And some of the page turns are on more ballots than I think anything else, like in prose and poetry, because a page turn can truly ruin a moment, or it can just beat that just beautiful, just greatness, because I get to have that moment and I get to know, okay, but we're moving on, right? So the way that you open your book, there are so many different ways to open the book. Different coaches are going to say different things. The main thing is that it looks professional, that it's well maintained. Inside the book, there's nothing that I'm going to see other than the black pages. I don't personally care about them being in sleeves. I always leave that up to my students if they like the feel of having a plastic sleeve to turn the page, or if they like having the paper. I have many students who prefer the paper because they like to be able to grip it. It feels more right. And I think that the book mechanics are what show people who have worked on this, people who have spent time on prose poetry, from the people. It's fine in my eyes.
Okay. When it comes to movement, like movement should always, I feel like in my novice sayings here, movement should always help enhance the piece, but sometimes like movement can be a big distraction away from like the moment that you're trying to create. How do y'all help kids understand like this is a good spot for movement versus this is a bad spot for movement?
I general rule of thumb for my students is any block of text can only have one gesture to it, right? And so we always talk about there are three kinds of gestures. There's demonstrative, where you're demonstrating how something is used. There's indicative, where you're like pointing to something or how tall something is, right? And then there are empty gestures, and we use that when we're talking. Like I use them constantly. There are gestures that actually do nothing, like what I'm doing right now with my hands, just flailing about. Those are empty gestures, and they're all appropriate when used right, and they just need to be in there in the performance, just sprinkled in evenly. But I think that you can over gesture, and I think it's totally possible to under gesture for the selection that you're reading. You know, if you're doing a more comedic piece, it might be a good idea to have more gestures to go along with the exaggerated facial expressions. However, it might be best to have more gestures in a dramatic piece where there are very few large facial expressions, and they're much more subtle. You know, it just depends again on connecting the performer to the piece itself. Having the right amount of gestures is like the book also, like it doesn't distract from the performance, it doesn't distract from the literature, but it enhances, like you said.
Yeah.
So I actually have a general rule of thumb because I'm almost always thinking NSDA. And so my brain, when I'm typically our prose or poetry pieces for a lot of those non-district kids, are there DI or HIs that will add a little bit to, or will do a little bit over the top. And even my district kids, right, they're still NSDA kids. And so we have a tendency to over gesture simply because when you get to those NSDA rounds, you have complete freedom in how you do things. And then we preach judge adaptation, right? Like again, my debate brain kind of comes in and it's like, okay, cool. I know that I have a, Kim Thunderberg down at Carthage, right? She wants minimal blocking. She wants the piece to be very delivered. She wants the literary elements. She wants the story told. Whereas if, shout out to Quasi Mentor, right? Like he's back there, he's a national champion in 6, 7, 8 events multiple times over. He's okay if you give a little more theatrics, move a little bit more with respect to the event. And so that's definitely a conversation I had with my interpreters. I was like, read your judge. If you can get away with a little bit, maybe that extra step that you might not have taken if you had, Kim, who was down at Carthage, who's now at Panola, or maybe you have a Jaquasi, or maybe you have a, Daniel, who's willing to let you take that step. Whereas some judges, like one of my best interpreters today, he didn't block anything. He just used his voice. He told you the story. He read it to you and you experienced it and you felt every tear gripping emotional moment with his voice. He didn't move his hands at all. He just told you a story and it was beautiful. And one of my better poetry kids, she's got a Hispanic heritage piece that I feel like her grandma's going to come out of the piece and hit me with a chancla. Right? Like, I mean, and so they don't like, I think the story, I think you hit on it. The literature like dictates a lot of what we do.
Right. Yeah.
Our judges dictate a lot of when we can use a little more, or when we know when we have, okay, cool. What's the minimalist blocking element? What's the maximus blocking element? And really that fine tuning that you talk about, right? Like spending those extra hours and those extra minutes and those extra seconds that they do at home with that book. I mean, when Jaquasi would help me come over here because again, I'm not I'm not an interp coach. I'm a debate guy who gets to do interp on the side. I've worked really hard to make sure my interpreters get equivocal time because it was a weakness of mine, and I'm trying. My team, if you're listening to this, I'm working. I'm diligently trying to make sure my interpreters get enough of my brain instead of the 13 UIL events that I get to do, plus all
Right.
the extra 2A duties. And so I we cover a lot of ground. We
Right.
coach judge adaptation. We teach, over because you can cut. You can never add on the fly. Adding on the fly becomes improv, and improv becomes really bad really quickly.
Oh, immediately. Yeah.
Okay. So, I've talked about technical skills, and that was like great. Like, I learned a lot in that section, so I'm sure other people did as well. When it comes to performance skills, like, what sets a student apart in a room full of other really good students? Like, I've heard singing, I've seen like just like really like dramatic pauses that really just like sucked me into the performance because I can enjoy a really good prose and poetry piece. I can't coach one, right? Like I'm just a good audience member. So like what sets, I guess, what helps set a student apart in a room full of students that realistically are that 1-2 level kid? I mean, that's state. So how do you judge a room like that?
Yeah. I think you actually said it already. The thing is that who sucks you into the piece, right? Like we have words that are printed on dead trees, and we have taken them and we're putting voices to them and we're bringing them to life. And if you can connect that to the judge, bottom line, the people who connect that to the judge the most, that's who wins, right? Like the person who is able to bring you into a story about about prom, right? Like there's nothing extraordinary about that. Like it's prom. Every high school student generally goes to prom. There's nothing exceptional about that. It's about the speaking the truth that that passes from people to people. It's about that human connection that we, back during COVID, we're all missing so much of. And I think that's why prose and poetry specifically is coming back just as strong as it ever was. Because it's showing humans who are humans, and it's allowing us to share those human moments. And when you can suck somebody into those words that were printed on dead trees, then you've won the battle. That's what it comes down to for me.
I think that's the difference, right? And you're as much of a qualified interp judge as you think you are. You need to give yourself more credit, because you can identify those things, right? You can identify what sets apart articulation, bookwork. All of those little things are the difference between a 1 and a 2. And then the 3 and 4, you start kind of nitpicking those things, especially at the state level. You're really getting into enunciation. You're really getting into character development. All of those things are the difference makers.
All right. Well, thank y'all. Y'all drew me into this podcast today. I feel like I had a great time listening to y'all talk about prose and poetry. I hope our audience did as well. Oh, there's the timer. Thanks for joining us for the first Constructive Speech and Debate podcast. And join us next time as we continue to go through this season talking about all things speech and debate. Thanks. Bye.